The leather journal had survived 3 wars, 2 floods, and a bar fight in Lagos. Its owner, Darren Holt, had survived worse. He sat in the sterile white waiting room of the Galactic Wellness Conclave on Station Oriole, flipping through a cargo manifest on his datapad and chewing on a protein stick that tasted like cardboard mixed with regret. He was here for one reason only. His cargo hauling license needed a medical clearance stamp every 2 years, and the nearest certified facility was this floating palace of alien medicine. Rena Cho, the human diplomat assigned to Station Oriole, sat beside him with her legs crossed and her expression carefully neutral. She had warned him 3 times on the walkover. The Fenari had never examined a human before. They were the finest healers in a known galaxy. Their species could regenerate entire limbs in a matter of weeks. They had no frame of reference for a species like humanity. Darren had nodded politely each time and continued chewing his protein stick. A tall figure appeared in the doorway. Senior healer Olis stood nearly 7 feet, her skin a pale, translucent blue that shifted like light through water. Her eyes were large and silver, and they studied Darren the way a jeweler might study a stone that did not belong in the collection. She gestured for him to follow. The examination room was enormous and impossibly clean. Every surface gleamed. The air smelled like nothing at all, which somehow made it worse. 6 junior healers stood along the far wall in matching white uniforms, their translucent faces showing veins of soft violet curiosity beneath the skin. One of them, a younger female with nervous hands, was introduced as Apprentice Sue. Olis instructed Darren to remove his upper clothing for the body scan. He pulled his shirt over his head and dropped it on the bench beside him. The room went still. His torso looked like a map drawn by someone who hated the traveler. A long surgical scar ran from his lower ribs to his hip, pale and raised. 2 circular marks on his left shoulder sat where bullets had entered and exited. A wide patch of rough skin across his back marked an old burn that had healed badly. Claw marks, for parallel lines, raked across his right side from a bear encounter 8 years ago. Smaller scars dotted his arms and chest like scattered punctuation, each one a sentence from a story no one in the room could read. One of the junior healers tilted her head and whispered something. Another let out a short breath that sounded almost like a laugh. A few exchanged glances. Sue pressed her lips together and looked at the floor. Olis stepped closer and touched the raised scar on his ribs with 2 long fingers. Her skin flickered a confused shade of green. She asked if these were decorative. Some species marked themselves for cultural or spiritual purposes. Darren looked down at her hand on his scar and shook his head. No, each one of those tried to kill him. The chuckling stopped. Olis ordered a full diagnostic scan. The machine hummed around Darren for 40 seconds and then projected a holographic display of his skeleton, musculature, and organ systems. The Fenari crowded around the display, and their confusion deepened. His bones showed multiple healed fractures, lines of calcium deposits where breaks had fused back together imperfectly. His muscle fibers were layered with micro-tear scar tissue that had rebuilt denser than original growth. His immune system was running at a level the Fenari associated with active parasitic warfare, yet there were no parasites present. His body was simply always ready for a fight that might never come. Darren sat on the examination bench, legs dangling, scrolling through his datapad. He looked up once and asked if everything was all right. Olis did not answer him directly. She turned to Rena, who had been watching quietly from the corner. She asked what kind of planet Earth was. Rena let a beat of silence pass before she answered. Earth was classified as a Category 12 death world. High gravity, extreme weather variance, predatory megafauna, toxic plant life, microbial hostility across every biome, tectonic instability, and 7 billion humans living on it who considered all of that perfectly normal. Olis looked back at the holographic scan of Darren's skeleton. She studied the healed fractures, the dense muscle layering, the immune system burning like a furnace with no fire to fight. Then she looked at Darren himself, sitting calmly on the bench, chewing the last of his protein stick. She asked him how old he was. He said 34. She asked how many of these injuries he had sustained before the age of 20. He thought about it and said probably half. Sue, the apprentice, had not moved from her spot near the wall. Her hands were clasped tightly in front of her. Her skin had gone almost completely pale, the violet curiosity drained away and replaced by something closer to quiet shock. Olis turned back toward the bench and noticed the corner of something brown and worn sticking out of Darren's bag. A leather-bound book, thick with age and use, its edges soft from years of handling. She asked what it was. Darren glanced at the journal and then back at Olis. He said it was his field book. He had kept it during his years as a combat medic. Notes, sketches, procedures. Things he had learned when proper tools were not available and people were dying. Olis asked if she could see it. Darren pulled the journal from his bag and held it out to her. He told her she was welcome to look through it if she wanted. He warned her that his handwriting was not great. Olis took the journal. It was heavier than she expected. She opened it to the first page, and everything the Conclave thought it knew about medicine began to fall apart. The ink on page 1 was faded but steady. The lines had been drawn with a hand that did not shake despite whatever had been happening around at the time. Olis held the journal open beneath the bright lights of the examination room and studied the first entry in silence.it was a hand-drawn diagram of a human chest cavity. The ribs were sketched with careful precision. Between them, a single entry point was marked with an arrow. Beside the diagram, in small, neat handwriting, were step-by-step instructions for performing an emergency chest decompression using a ballpoint pen casing and medical tape. At the bottom of the page, a short note read, "No kit. No time. Pen worked." Private Hale breathed again. Olis read the note twice. She looked up at Darren, who was sitting on the bench, pulling his shirt back on. She asked him to explain. Darren leaned back and rubbed the side of his neck. He said it happened on his second deployment. His squad had been hit by a roadside blast. The medic kit was gone, blown apart in the explosion along with half their vehicle. A 19-year-old soldier named Hale was on the ground with a collapsed lung. Air was leaking into his chest cavity and pressing against his lung from the outside. Every breath was smaller than the last. Hale had maybe 4 minutes. Darren had a ballpoint pen and a roll of tape in his pocket. He broke the pen apart, used the hollow casing as a tube, and punched it through the chest wall between the ribs to release the trapped air. Hale screaming. Then he breathed. Darren taped the tube in place and kept pressure until the evacuation arrived. He wrote the journal entry that night in the back of a transport truck. He said he figured someone else might need to know how to do it someday. Olis turned to page 2 without speaking. It described how to set a compound fracture using strips of cloth torn from a military uniform and straight sticks gathered from the ground. The notes included warnings about bone alignment and the danger of severed blood vessels near the break. A small sketch showed the binding technique. Page 3 was a tourniquet guide. It detailed how to stop catastrophic limb bleeding using a belt, a stick, and steady pressure. The note at the bottom said, "Tighten until the bleeding stops or the patient screams. If they stop screaming, tighten more." Page 4 made Sue step back from the group. It described how to cauterize an open wound with a heated blade when infection was a greater threat than pain. The entry was written in the same calm handwriting. At the bottom it read, "Fire hurts. Infection kills. Choose." Olis passed the journal to one of the junior healers. It moved through the group slowly. Each healer took a page or two, read in silence, and then passed it on with a face that had gone a shade paler than before. The nervous laughter from earlier was gone completely. No one was smiling. No one was whispering. Sue received the journal last. She held it like it was something fragile, though the leather was tough and worn. She opened to a random page near the middle and found an entry about removing a bullet from a thigh using a pocket knife and a bottle of alcohol poured directly into the wound. The patient had been Darren himself. The note at the bottom read, "No anesthetic. Put down on my belt. Got out on the third try." Sue closed the journal and looked at Darren. She asked him if all humans knew how to do these things, that he said no. Only the ones who had to. She asked how many humans had to die. He said more than anyone would like to count. Olis took the journal back from Sue and held it in both hands. She told Darren that in the Conclave's 700 years of operation, they had treated over 4,000 species. They had cured diseases that could dissolve bone. They had regrown entire nervous systems. They had never once encountered a species that documented how to perform surgery on itself with objects found on the ground. Darren shrugged. He said Earth did not come with a medical supply closet. You learned to work with what you had, or you watch people die. Most medics chose the first option. The examination room door opened, and a broad figure filled the frame. Director Pell was a Grun, wide-shouldered and thick-limbed with 4 arms folded across his chest. His gray skin was smooth and featureless, and his expression carried the permanent look of someone who had somewhere more important to be. He glanced at Darren, then at the cluster of healers standing in stunned silence, then at the clock on the wall. He asked why a routine medical clearance was taking 3 hours. Olis stepped forward and held out the journal without a word. Pell took it with his lower left hand and opened it with mild irritation. He flipped past the first few pages. His pace slowed. He stopped on a page and read it fully. Then he turned to the next. Then the next. His 4 arms slowly unfolded. His irritation faded. Something else replaced it. Something the junior healers had never seen on Director Pell's face before. He looked at Darren and asked a single question. "How are you alive?" Darren met his eyes and gave the same answer he had given a dozen times before. Humans are hard to kill. Director Pell had read 9 pages of the journal before he stopped turning. He stood in the middle of the examination room with the book open in his lower hands while his upper arms hung at his sides like they had forgotten their purpose. His gray face had not changed expression, but the silence around him told the room everything it needed to know. He closed the journal carefully and handed it back to Olis. Then he looked at Darren, who was sitting on the bench with his legs crossed and his datapad balanced on one knee. Darren looked up with the face of a man waiting for a bus, not a man who had just handed an alien civilization a window in a human suffering. Pell asked him what his current occupation was. Darren said he hauled cargo, mostly dry goods and machine parts between mid-rim stations. Pell asked what his previous occupation was. Darren said he was a combat medic for 8 years. Before that, a volunteer field responder during natural disasters. Before that, a teenager who grew up on a cattle ranch where you learned to stitch up wounds on animals and sometimes on yourself. Pell turned to Olis and said nothing for a long moment. Then he said something that made every junior healer in the room stand a little straighter. He said the Conclave should convene a knowledge session, a full one, with the entire medical staff. Olis agreed immediately. She had been about to suggest the same thing. She asked Darren if he would be willing to stay on the station for a day or two and present his journal to the assembled healers. She explained that this was not a casual request. The Conclave had not called a full knowledge session in 11 years. The last one had been for the discovery of a new regenerative compound found in deep-sea organisms on a water world. Darren looked at Rena. Rena raised her eyebrows and gave a small shrug that said, "This is your call." Darren asked if the station cafeteria would feed him for free during his stay. Pell blinked all 4 of his eyes at once. He said yes. Darren said he would stay. The announcement went out within the hour. A full knowledge session had been called by Director Pell and Senior Healer Olis jointly. The subject was listed as Emergency Medical Practices of the Human Species, Earth, Category 12 Death World. Attendance was mandatory for all senior and mid-level healers. Apprentices were encouraged. Word spread fast through the station. The Fenari were not a species prone to gossip, but they were deeply prone to curiosity. By the end of the day, almost everyone on Station Oriole had heard that a human cargo hauler was sitting in the cafeteria eating his fourth meal and carrying a book that had made Director Pell go quiet. That evening, Darren sat in the cafeteria with a tray of food he could not fully identify, but found surprisingly decent. Rena sat across from him, nursing a cup of something warm and watching him eat with a look that was halfway between amusement and concern. She told him he did not have to do this. A knowledge session in front of 200 Fenari healers was not a small thing. These were the most respected medical minds in the galaxy. They had healed species that most civilizations did not even know existed. They would have questions. Darren chewed slowly and swallowed. He said he had once given a field lecture on tourniquet application while being shelled. 200 polite aliens in a clean room did not scare him. Rena smiled, but did not laugh. She asked him if he understood what his journal meant to them. The Fenari healed perfectly. Their bodies regenerated without scars, without cost, without memory of the wound. They had built an entire civilization around the idea that damage could always be undone. His journal was proof that an entire species existed where damage was permanent, healing was painful, and the healers themselves were often the ones bleeding. Darren set down his fork and looked at her. He said he understood. He said that was exactly why he was going to stand up there tomorrow and talk about it. Because somewhere out on the frontier, some alien medic was going to find themselves without tools, without backup, and without a species that could regenerate. And when that happened, the difference between life and death might be knowing how to use a pen to save along. Rena held his gaze for a moment and then nodded. That night, Sue stood outside the cafeteria long after it had closed. She had not gone in. She had watched through the glass as the human ate and talked with the diplomat. She had seen him laugh once, a short and rough sound, and she had watched the way he moved. Carefully, not because he was fragile, but because his body carried the memory of every impact it had ever taken and still chose to keep going. She went back to her quarters and pulled up every file the Conclave had on Deathworld species. There were very few. Most Deathworld species never made it off their planets. The ones that did were usually violent, short-lived, and isolated. Humans were the exception. They had survived their world, built civilizations on top of its hostility, and then looked up at the stars and decided to go there too. Not because their planet was safe enough to leave, but because they had gotten so used to surviving that exploration felt like the next logical step. Sue closed the files and stared at the ceiling of her room. Tomorrow, 200 of the galaxy's finest healers were going to sit in a lecture hall and listen to a cargo hauler explain how to save a life with a pen. She was not going to miss it. 219 Fenari healers filled the main lecture hall of the Conclave. The room was shaped like a wide bowl, with curved rows of seats rising from a central stage. Every seat was taken. A few apprentices sat on the steps. The lights were bright and even, and the air carried the faint, clean smell that seemed to follow the Fenari everywhere they went. Darren stood at the center of the stage, holding his journal. He wore the same clothes he had arrived in. A gray cargo shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, dark trousers with oil stains near the knees, and boots that had walked across more ground than most of the people in this room knew existed. He had not prepared speech. He had not made slides or holograms or diagrams for the display screens behind him, but he had his book. That was enough. He opened with something the Fenari did not expect. He told them he was not a doctor. He was not a scientist. He was a cargo hauler who used to be a combat medic. And before that, he was a kid on a ranch who learned to stitch a wound because the nearest hospital was 2 hours away and cattle did not wait for appointments that a few of the Fenari shifted in their seats. They had expected formality. They got a man with scarred hands and a calm voice. Darren opened the journal and held it up so the front rows could see the first page. He said this was where it started. Page 1, a collapsed lung and a ballpoint pen. He told the story the same way he had told it to Olis. Plainly, without drama. The details carried their own weight. Then he explained something that silenced the room completely. He said that on Earth, the body did not regenerate. When a human was cut, the body built scar tissue over the wound. It was rough and imperfect. It did not look like what was there before. It did not work as well as what was there before. But it held. The body chose survival over perfection every single time. Duddy told them that every scar on his body was a place where something had tried to end him and his biology had said no. Not elegantly, not cleanly, just stubbornly, roughly, and permanently. He walked them through the journal one entry at a time. He told them about Private Hale and the pen. He told them about a woman named Dara whose arm he set with sticks after a building collapsed on her during an earthquake in Turkey. He told them about a boy, no more than 6 years old, that he carried across open desert for 6 hours because their vehicle had been hit and the boy's legs were broken. He told them about the night he sat alone in a foxhole and stitched his own shoulder closed with fishing line because every other member of his squad was unconscious, or worse, he did not raise his voice. He did not pause for effect. He spoke the way a man speaks when the things he is describing are simply part of his life and not performances for an audience. The Fenari listened. Some of them had their hands pressed flat against their desks. Others had gone completely still, their translucent skin showing deep shades of gray and violet that Darren did not know how to read, but Rena, sitting in the back row, recognized as distress. Darren turned to a page near the middle of the journal. He held it up and showed a sketch of a human leg with a bullet still lodged near the femur. He said this one was his. He had removed the bullet himself with a pocket knife and a bottle of alcohol. There was no anesthetic. He bit down on his belt and worked by flashlight. It took 3 attempts. He got out. He poured the alcohol into the wound, packed it with clean cloth, and walked 11 miles to the nearest outpost the next morning. Sue, sitting in the 3rd row, had not blinked in what felt like minutes. Her silver eyes were wide and fixed on Darren with an expression that was no longer shock. It was something deeper, something close to reverence for a kind of strength she had never been taught existed. She raised her hand. Darren pointed to her. She asked if the scars caused him pain. He said some of them. The ones on his back ached when the weather changed. The knee he had blown out years ago predicted rain better than any forecast. The shoulder he stitched with fishing line pulled tight when he reached overhead. She asked why he did not have them removed. Galactic medicine could erase every scar on his body in a single session. He could walk out looking like he had never been touched. The hall went quiet. Every healer leaned forward slightly, waiting. Darren looked at Sue for a long moment. Then he said he kept them because they reminded him of the people he saved. Every scar had a name attached to it. Not his name. The name of someone who was alive because he had been willing to bleed. In 01 in the hall spoke. No one moved. Olis rose from her seat in the front row. She stood tall, her silver eyes steady, and she addressed the full assembly. She said she was formally requesting that Darren's journal be copied and entered into the Conclave's medical archive. The room erupted. The argument lasted 2 hours. It would have lasted longer if Pell had not finally slammed one of his 4 fists on the podium hard enough to crack the surface. The hall split almost evenly. Half the senior healers supported Olis and wanted the journal archived immediately. The other half, led by a cluster of elder Fenari who had served the Conclave for over a century, considered it an insult. The archive contained the most advanced medical knowledge in the galaxy. Regenerative gene therapies, neural reconstruction maps, cellular repair sequences that could rebuild an organ from a single surviving cell. To place a handwritten notebook full of field surgery beside those records felt, to them, like hanging a child's drawing in a gallery of masterworks. Pell stood at the podium and let both sides speak. He had his own reservations. He had seen what was inside the journal, and it had shaken something loose in him that he did not enjoy feeling. But he was a bureaucrat before he was anything else, and bureaucrats did not make decisions based on feelings. Olis made her case calmly. She said the Conclave had always operated from a position of abundance. They healed with perfect tools, in perfect facilities, with regenerative biology backing every procedure. Their knowledge was extraordinary, but it was built on the assumption that resources would always be available. Darren's journal represented something they had never once considered. Medicine performed when everything had failed. When the tools were gone, the facility was gone, and the healer's own body was falling apart alongside the patient. One of the elder healers stood and countered. He said that the Conclave did not archive primitive methods. The purpose of the archive was to preserve the highest standard of care, not the lowest. Sue stood up from the third row. She had not planned to speak. Her hands were shaking slightly, and her skin had gone almost white, which for a Fenari meant she was either terrified or furious. In Sue's case, it was both, she said, with a voice that started quiet and grew steady, that the Conclave had never sent a healer into a death world environment. They had never deployed a medic to a frontier outpost where supply ships came once a year. They had never treated a patient in the middle of a war zone or on the floor of a collapsing building. And if they ever did, every technique in the archive would be useless. Every gene therapy required a functioning lab. Every neural reconstruction needed a surgical suite. Every cellular repair sequence demanded equipment that weighed more than the ship carrying it. She pointed at the journal sitting on the stage beside Darren. She said that book was written by a man who saved lives with a pen, a knife, sticks, and fishing line. If even one Conclave healer ever found themselves without their tools, that journal might be the only thing standing between them and a dead patient. The hall went quiet. Sue sat down. Her hands were still shaking. Darren, who had been sitting in the back row eating a sandwich he had taken from the cafeteria, looked at Rena and raised his eyebrows. Rena whispered that the young one had just done something very brave. Darren nodded and went back to his sandwich. Pell called for the vote. It was not unanimous, but it passed with a clear majority. The journal would be digitized and entered into the archive under a new category that had never existed before: survival medicine under hostile conditions. Darren Holt would be listed as the contributing author. After the session ended and the hall emptied, Darren walked back to the cafeteria. He was tired in the way that talking about old memories always made him tired. Not in his body, but somewhere behind his ribs where the weight of years pressed against things he usually kept locked down. He sat at a corner table with a tray of food and the journal beside him. The cafeteria was mostly empty. The lights had dimmed to their evening setting, casting soft blue shadows across the tables. Sue appeared at the edge of his table. She stood there for a moment without speaking, her silver eyes studying him with something that was no longer curiosity or shock. It was respect, the kind that came not from admiration of strength, but from understanding what that strength had cost. She asked if she could sit. He pushed the chair out with his boot. She sat across from him and folded her hands on the table. She was quiet for a while. Then she asked him what the hardest entry in the journal was to write. Darren stopped chewing. He set his fork down and stared at the table for a long time. The cafeteria hummed softly around them. Somewhere a machine clicked and whirred. He said it was the last page. Sue asked what was on the last page. Darren looked at her. His face was calm, but his eyes carried something heavy and old that the Fenari had no word for because their species had never needed one. He said it was the names of the ones he could not save. Sue did not look away. She did not flinch. She sat across from him in the dim blue light of an alien cafeteria and said she would like to hear about them, if he was willing to tell her. Darren picked up his fork. He put it back down. He pulled the journal toward him and opened it to the last page. He was willing. The last page of the journal was different from the rest. There were no diagrams, no sketches of wounds or instructions for field procedures. There is only a list of names written in different inks, some faded and some dark, spread across the years like a timeline of Lost Point 11 names. 11 people Darren had tried to save and failed. That he did not describe how they died. He did not talk about the injuries or the circumstances or the things he could have done differently. Instead, he told Sue who they were. The first name was a soldier named Webb. Webb had been 22 and obsessed with birds. He kept a small notebook of every species he spotted during deployments and had planned to study ornithology when he got home. He bled out from a femoral wound while Darren held pressure with both hands and begged him to stay awake. Webb's last words were about a hawk he had seen that morning. The second name was a woman named Priya. She had been a relief worker during a flood in southern India. A wall collapsed on her while she was handing out water bottles. Darren pulled her out and worked on her for 20 minutes. She had just become a mother 3 months before. She died looking at a photograph on her phone. Darren went through each name slowly. He did not rush. He gave each person their full weight. A father of 4 who told jokes while Darren tried to stop the bleeding. A teenager who had lied about his age to join a rescue crew. A grandmother who refused to leave her house during an earthquake and was found under the rubble holding her cat. Both of them gone. Sue listened to every word without interrupting. Her hands were flat on the table. Her skin had shifted to a deep, still blue that Darren had not seen before. Among the Finari, it was the color of mourning. When Darren finished, the cafeteria was completely silent. The evening cycle had dimmed the lights further, and the two of them sat in a small pool of soft glow surrounded by shadows. Sue spoke carefully. She said that in Finari culture, a healer who lost a patient was considered to have failed. The loss was treated as a deficiency in skill or preparation. Finari healers who experienced multiple losses often left the profession entirely, unable to bear the weight of what their society told them they should have prevented. Darren nodded slowly. He said that in human culture, it was the same. A medic who lost someone carried that weight forever. The difference was that humans did not stop. They grieved, they blamed themselves, they woke up in the middle of the night replaying the moment over and over. And then they got up the next morning and did it again. Because the next patient was already bleeding and guilt was a luxury that could wait. Sue was quiet for a long time. Then she asked him a question that no Finari had ever asked a human before. She asked if it was worth it. Darren looked at her. He said that was the wrong question. The right question was whether the people he saved thought it was worth it. And since most of them were still alive, he figured the answer was yes. The next morning, Darren reported to the examination wing for the last time. Olis was waiting for him with the clearance form already prepared. She guided him through the final scan, which took less than a minute. Everything was as it had been the day before. Healed fractures, dense muscles, an immune system running hot, and scars covering nearly every surface of his body. Olis picked up the clearance form and filled it out by hand. Under the section marked notable medical observations, she wrote a single line. Patient is extensively scarred. Each scar is evidence of survival under conditions this conclave cannot replicate. No treatment required. No treatment recommended. She signed it and handed it to Darren. Their hands touched briefly during the exchange. Her skin was cool and smooth. His was rough and warm and mapped with history that he thanked her. She told him it was the conclave that owed thanks to him. Sue was waiting outside the examination wing. She did not say much. She shook his hand and held it for a moment longer than necessary. She told him she would read the journal copy every day until she understood it completely. He told her he hoped she never had to use any of it. She said she hoped the same, but she would be ready if she did. Darren walked to the docking port with his bag over one shoulder and the journal tucked inside. Rena caught up with him halfway there, slightly out of breath. She asked him how it felt to have his journal in the most prestigious medical archive in the galaxy, sitting alongside regenerative gene therapies and neural reconstruction maps. Right there in the permanent record of the finest healing institution ever built, Darren kept walking. He shifted the bag on his shoulder and thought about it for a few steps. He said it felt the same as it always had. Heavy. Rena did not ask anything else. She walked beside him in silence until he reached his ship point 6 months later. The Galactic Wellness Conclave published a revised emergency medical curriculum for frontier and hostile environment scenarios. It was the first major update to the field care section in over 300 years. The curriculum was distributed to every medical outpost, frontier station, and colony ship in the known galaxy. The first module was titled, "When the Healer is Also Bleeding." The opening page contained a hand-drawn diagram of a human chest cavity. Between the ribs, a single entry point was marked with an arrow. Beside the diagram, in small, neat handwriting that had been carefully preserved from the original, were step-by-step instructions for performing an emergency chest decompression using a pen casing and tape. Below the diagram, in small text, it read, "From the Field Notes of Darren Holt, Earth." Page 1.